So today we're going to talk about reframing Maslow's hierarchy, and I'll share a little bit about the things that it means to me in my work and the way that I've learned to reframe the conceptual background behind it. And I'll interweave a little bit about how augmented and virtual reality are bringing new capacities to our ability to climb up Maslow's hierarchy, as it were. Most people are familiar with Maslow's hierarchy as sort of an early form of positive psychology. It was one of the roots that sort of led to the modern definition of the positive psychology movement today. And it really is a theory of motivation that suggests that as human beings, we first fulfill our most basic needs for physiological grounding, for food, for shelter, for physical touch, before moving on to safety and security. And then we progress into sort of more advanced needs and desires that we have time to focus on, such as love and intimacy and family, self-esteem. And finally, at the highest level, we have reached a level of awareness where we're able to achieve our potential. But what most people don't know about Maslow's hierarchy is that its roots go actually much deeper than the 1943 paper published by Abraham Maslow. This is a photo of Abe Maslow in 1938, where he was actually engaged in a field study on a Blackfoot Native American reservation. It was funded by the Social Science Research Council, where he was granted the sort of remit of studying the security needs of tribal culture. And shortly after this trip, he actually published the famous Maslow's Hierarchy, which is still widely in use today in many different fields. This woman is a tribal member in the Gitson First Nation, and she and many others have called attention to this trip that he took to the Blackfoot Reservation, and actually highlight that he took a lot of what ended up in Maslow's hierarchy from First Nation ideals and concepts and frameworks. So this is Dr. Cindy Blackstock, and she says it's basically a ripoff of Blackfoot ideology. First of all, the triangle is not a triangle, it's supposed to be a teepee. And the teepee, of course, always goes up into the sky. So this is actually Dr. Blackstock's reframing and sort of reimagining of Maslow's hierarchy next to the indigenous First Nation perspective. So, of course, she calls out that in Maslow's hierarchy, he had to sort of reify and redefine the concepts that he learned and frame them in a way that would be accepted by Western psychology and Western science. So he had a much more sort of limited scope of view. He looked at the individual perspective, whereas in the First Nations perspective, there's a much more expansive concept of time. There are multiple dimensions of reality. And there's a really important switch here, which is that self-actualization is not at the top of the pyramid. In the First Nation perspective, you'll actually find it at the bottom. It's where life begins. And only when we've reached self-actualization are we able to climb into the higher realms of community actualization and then reaching this level of cultural perpetuity, which is a concept that in the Blackfoot tradition is about preserving the knowledge and wisdom that you have from your elders and passing it on using the breath of life. So a lot of people have looked at this idea. There's, for example, this book called On Native Self-Actualization that describes the origins of Maslow's hierarchy in Native American teachings on holistic health and wellness, and how the story of how Maslow had to redefine what he learned. And this also publishes some of his early writings on his time with the Blackfoot tribe that have never seen the light of day. So I think it's time to correct this act of cultural appropriation and reframe our understanding of human needs based on not just this earlier wisdom, but also the ability for this knowledge to continue to be updated over time. So that's actually consistent with the tradition in which this hierarchy, this progression of needs began. So in the Blackfoot tribe, the tradition is that if you come across a new piece of wisdom that seems valid to you, or that seems important and useful, you share it with 4 members of your tribe that are elders or other wise people, and they basically serve as your peer review committee. And if that wisdom is deemed to be valuable, then it might be incorporated into a ritual and passed down the generations. So current scientific thinking, even though Maslow's hierarchy is used still today in many different fields, including urban planning and development, and hospice care, a lot of different areas are still using this as a framework to sort of understand how we can cover people's base needs and move towards self-actualization. The current scientific thinking has really debunked this idea that we focus on one need, and then only once that need has been satisfied are we able to move on to the next one. The reality is all of the core drives are equally important. We really just focus on the deficiency of the most base needs much more if we don't have them. But after, if we're not starving and if we have, a decent sense of physical security, all of those core drives are actually present at the same time. And this has really important policy implications for anyone who's doing impact work. So there was a landmark study that was done by a University of Illinois psychologist, Ed Diner, from 2005 to 2010, where he really looked at discovering if there was a scientific basis in reality for the hierarchy, and this was really where we understood that the Maslow's hierarchy of needs are more like vitamins. We need all of them. They're not, we can't construct social policy on the idea that until every single person in a community has their most basic needs met, we shouldn't ever focus on the community and actualization needs. So to me, the most important lesson from the original conceptualization of this progression of human needs, this Maslow's hierarchy that was actually taken from a much earlier set of wisdom, is the connection between individual actualization and community actualization. For many years, I've been interested in how to improve human decision-making and expand our capacity to engage in long-term thinking. And that's really, to me, what this type of framework is useful for understanding and expanding our capacities in. So in 2010, I co-founded an augmented reality company called DACRI. And one of the first ideas that I had about how we could use augmented reality is that it could actually help us improve our capability to engage in long-term thinking and make better decisions along the way. So I had this idea that augmented reality could serve as a time bridge. What is a time bridge? Well, how many people here have seen Ready Player One or read the book? All right. Do you remember when Wade is just gotten his new rig and he, on a whim, clicks a button to activate the wellness or the healthcare protocol? So he has to do a 2-hour workout or whatever it is before he can actually log into the Oasis every day. That is an example of a time bridge. It's a kind of tool or a kind of framework that allows you to basically bridge time from the moment that you make a decision into the future where the impact of that decision has been realized. So going to the gym is a decision. A lot of people make that decision on January 1st. Yes, I will go to the gym more regularly. It's my New Year's resolution. I want to do this. And then, a couple weeks later, pizza and beer sounds great. You're having drinks with your friends. You don't have a time bridge. You don't have you don't necessarily have the ability to maintain the same level of motivation that you did on January 1. So that's what I call a time bridge. It's a tool. and this is a great example of it, where it's something that helps you essentially maintain a commitment that you've made, potentially to yourself. So an example in augmented reality of a time bridge, around the time when we were starting DACRI, there was this crazy initiative on a ballot to actually drill in the Grand Canyon. And I'd come from a background in sustainable tech and the sustainability world, and so I immediately started thinking about how can people how could people vote for this? And I thought if we could create a time bridge where people actually saw the impact of the decision to vote for this initiative 10 years down the line, we could use augmented reality to do that, and it would be immediately wiped off the ballot. No one would ever vote for it. So that was sort of one of my original conceptions for how augmented reality could be used to visualize a future impact today and help us make better decisions and think long term. But my fantasy of what was possible at that time was far ahead of the current capabilities of the technology in 2010. AR was still in the early stages of its development. It was dealing with its basic physiological needs. It was at the bottom of the pyramid, if you will. And I was ready for AR to self-actualize. So it was still looking for its sensors, its computer vision, all of those things were being developed, and it was young and still learning and growing. But quickly, we started finding more and more valuable use cases for AR. A lot of the areas that we work in at DACRI are in training and operations, and we got some really great results for our customers. I'll just give you a couple of examples. Time savings, we found that 30 to 50% increase in efficiency were pretty common in industrial applications of AR, where you're looking at learning a new process or improving a manufacturing workflow. Certainly increased accuracy in inspections, preventive maintenance, assembly, that kind of thing. Increased quality and ensuring consistency and standardization across the process. So we created a lot of value for our customers and really helped them see that existing processes were able to be greatly improved with AR. But I was interested in not just improving what currently existed, I was interested in using AR to create the future. So in the last few years, I've really been working on, in the last year, I've really been working on using augmented reality and other technologies in the impact space. And my goal is to support the development of independent, self-determining, yet fully connected communities around the world. So these are some of the ingredients that I would put into my own new framework for a progression of human needs, not just at an individual level, but at a community level. So at the individual level, those 7 areas are really about an individual experience, an internal belief, or an internal narrative. And they show up in a community experience in a little bit of a different way, and you can sort of draw parallels between them. In a community experience, they're more about external representation. What do you see in the community around you, and how does that communicate about the state of the community and its values and what that means to you? So there's actually, obviously, individuals will affect the community, and the community that you live in will affect your ability as an individual to expand in all of these areas as well. And in the community, you also look at incentives, rules, and infrastructure as key areas where these 7 sort of buckets will show up. So I wish I had time to make a wonderful interactive graphic representation for this talk, but I was a little bit pressed for time. So I'm not sure how well you can see this, but I'll give just a couple of examples. So in the case of at the sort of center of the series of concentric circles, I see it more as a sort of overlapping circles rather than a pyramid. We have security. And to me, that's not just security as in physical security. It's the security of your health care, security of food and shelter, your basic needs, rest. And in a community level, that's really about your food supply chain, your housing availability, manufacturing. So you could look at, at the base level, I think one of the key capabilities for a truly independent, self-actualized community is actually having really short supply chains in all of those different areas around security. So around food, are you shipping food from hundreds of miles away, or are you able to grow food locally that is more nutritious? Similarly, in manufacturing, are you able to fabricate the goods that you need at a local level using next generation fabrication? Potentially would be a great capacity there. Or are you shipping things from around the world, and what are your trade agreements? What are your how is your economy set up? And then, of course, in some of those other areas around healthcare and food, it's not just the physical infrastructure; it's also the culture. How is it represented? What are the expectations, and what are the incentives? So, looking at sort of a model of evaluating the health of a community and its ability to self-actualize, you would look at all of those things. Next, we have trust and play. Self-trust being first and trust of others being second. Because if you don't have the first, you can't get to the second one. And to me, without trust, you can't have playfulness, and play is a really valuable skill that we have as communities, because it enables us to learn and grow, and it's part of innovation. Agency and creativity, that's about learning mastery, experimentation, psychological safety, and creative freedom. So that area is really about innovation. How can is a community able to create new innovation? And psychological safety is fundamental to the process of innovation, because if you don't have a culture where it's okay to make a mistake, then you'll never have somebody share a creative idea or take a creative risk. Mindfulness and emotional intelligence, we start to get into contemplative practices, the ability to heal on an emotional level. And then contribution. I think everyone on the planet wants to feel that they're able to make a contribution to their community in a way that it is recognized and appreciated and valued. And so a community's ability to actually make that opportunity available is one of the key sort of indicators of its ability to self-actualize. So what does that look like? Well, there's different things that you could imagine. One would be the continuous regeneration of its infrastructure. That means that there will be meaningful work on a continuous basis. And of course, that's needed for cities. And the development of new capacities. And again, that sort of echoes back to innovation. And then we have long-term thinking and transcendence, which are a little bit fuzzier in terms of transcendence is a little bit fuzzier in terms of what specifically is needed. I think that's more on an individual level. But in terms of long-term thinking, we're going to go back to XR and see how else it can sort of help support that capacity. So a few of the gifts of XR, some of these are going to be familiar. I'm going to just highlight a couple of examples that I think are fun. So we know that particularly augmented reality, also virtual reality, is really good at accelerating learning. I'm going to talk about a study that specifically highlights the ability of AR as a training tool that actually reduces cognitive load and minimizes cognitive differences in individuals, so that it sort of levels the playing field in everyone's ability to do a new task. Preserving knowledge, creating empathy, virtual reality is famous, many studies on this subject. Supporting healing, physical and mental health. We know that VR has been used in that context for several years now, many years now, actually probably close on 15, as long as this conference has been around. Understanding the truth, I'm going to give an example about that. I think that's kind of a not necessarily intuitive, but really an intriguing new use case for XR. And then imagining the future, which goes to the long-term thinking. So this is a study that was done in 2013 called Using Augmented Reality to Cognitively Guide Assembly. And this was a really interesting one for me because it was able to show not just improved accuracy and reduction in errors, which had been done before, but actually the they were able to measure a reduction in cognitive load in the participants. So you can imagine if I asked you to put together a set of Lego blocks into this formation, that you might incur some cognitive load. You might need to really focus and think about what's the placement, orientation, and scale. What are the different parts? What's the order of operations? How is this going to work? And they compared video and paperwork instructions and augmented reality workflow instructions in this group of participants. And so with an augmented reality tool, you're basically able to see the pieces in the exact order that they need to go, the placement, orientation, and scale of where they need to go. And the experience of the participants was easy. I didn't actually feel like I was building something complicated. I felt like I was supported, and I enjoyed it, and I would recommend this to others as a learning tool. This is an example of XR being used to discover the truth. So I don't know if anybody saw this. This was just a week and a half ago or so. The New York Times actually created an augmented reality scene where they used photographic evidence that was inadvertently reported by Russian intelligence around a Syrian chemical attack. And what happened was, this was back in April, there was chlorine gas that was dropped on an apartment in Syria, killing dozens of people on a balcony. And of course, the Syrian government immediately denied the allegations. And through sort of photographic reconstruction of the scene, the Times was actually able to do a truly investigative journalism initiative where they were able to prove that spatially, where the placement of the artifacts were, in terms of the pieces of infrastructure of the building, where the bodies were found, the timestamps of when things were found, and the location of the chemical traces, that it was physically impossible for the situation to have been anything other than a chemical attack. So it's a really interesting tool. And this, by the way, is another example of a real-world use case that was imagined in fiction first. So has anyone seen Iron Man 3? You remember in somewhere toward the end where he sort of has an augmented reality recreation of a scene, and he's actually using it to reconstruct and find out what happened. This is an actual real-world example of that happening and being used in a way that is globally important and has ramifications and supporting the fight against the tyranny of the Syrian government. And the last one that I'll talk about is visions of the future. So around innovation and around a community specifically increasing its capacity to innovate. Augmented and virtual realities are now being used in world-building processes where there's a collection of members of a community who are brought together to not just imagine sort of where they want, what narrative they might want to create about the future of their community, but actually using AR and VR, those conversations are fleshed out in a way that makes them feel real. Let me back up a little bit and explain kind of where this is coming from. So, world building is a practice that has been used for many years in film and gaming, and I learned about 2 years ago of an example where it was being used to actually support the development of a community determining where it wanted to go in its future. So if you've heard of the Never Alone game, Alan Gershenfeld, who was presenting here yesterday, worked with the Alaska Cook Inlet Tribal Council and brought a world-building process to that community where they were actually able to move past some of their current limitations in their thinking by using this tool to bring in knowledge from both within the tribe and also experts in specific fields around technology and the sciences and the arts. And it changed the dynamics around how the conversation was able to evolve because of their ability to visualize concretely and in an immersive context the ideas and the concepts that they were discussing. And so some of the experience that the tribal members have shared around this process is that they felt that it was a collective tool that was able to really change the conversation, change the dynamic, and help them overcome some of the objections that might normally come up in a conversation around developing future innovations in their community. And some of the outcomes that have come out of that process were, number one, the development of sort of new technology ideas and products that the tribe could then build. But I think in a sort of deeper, more interesting way, there's a new initiation ritual that was created out of this world-building process where every 13-year-old in the tribe now actually, as an initiation rite at that age, takes a piece of tribal wisdom and infuses it into a next-generation technology and does a project around that, exploring what that could mean and what future capabilities could be fused with ancient tribal techniques and wisdom. So to me, that's a really important feature of AR and VR, is that they're giving us a greater capacity to imagine with greater fidelity and granularity and realism the kind of future that we all want to create. So with that, I will thank you very much. And if you have any questions, please find me after outside.